Welcome to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Jonathan Duprat, the CCO at Artorias.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we are joined by Thomas, a friend of ours on Twitter, who is a reporter who focuses on a lot of conflicts. But for this specific episode, he's a great source of information in Myanmar. So Thomas, first, welcome aboard.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Thomas, for this episode, we really want to focus on the civil war in Myanmar that I think gets almost little to no international attention, and specifically for a lot of the, probably people in the United States who have a very small understanding of the situation. I mean, this is a civil war that has been going on. I mean, Myanmar has a long history of civil war, but this latest one, has been going on for years now. But there's a fundamental difference this latest round of the civil war, and it does look like the junta seems to be in trouble. But before we go into the details, I'd love for you to kind of start it off with just kind of a general overview and kind of the history of this latest round of violence and where you think the situation might end.
Yeah, so the latest civil war, or like the phase of the already ongoing war in Myanmar, started a little over 4 years ago. It didn't receive a lot of coverage at the time in 2021 because, the whole world was in the grips of the COVID pandemic and all the countries were just in their own crisis. But what happened in Myanmar at the time was that a rather fragile civilian government, which had been sharing power in Myanmar with the military for the better part of 10 years, was overthrown by that very same military. And what happened afterwards was that a large part of the Burmese people of Burmese society rose up against that coup, against military rule. The military, being an autocratic regime, responded very violently towards this protest. There were crackdowns, there were shootings, hundreds of people were killed. And what then happened was that a lot of young Burmese students, but also farmers, fishermen, you name it, they wouldn't allow themselves to be repressed. So they went into the jungles, into the border regions, where they linked up with already existing rebel groups that were mostly from ethnic minorities, from specific peripheral regions. And basically they took up arms and turned a anti-coup protest movement into a armed rebellion. And now, 4 years later, in 2025, Myanmar is in a situation where the military is really on the back foot. According to estimates, like including also research that I've done myself on the military situation in the country, the military now controls less than like 40% of the territory of the country of Myanmar, while armed resistance groups and ethnic rebel armies really dominate the border regions of the countries, the less populated regions, and are really now advancing and hitting the military on multiple fronts, which has really caused already some predictions and speculations that the military regime could be facing a military defeat in a similar style as what we witnessed with the Assad regime in Syria sometime in the foreseeable future.
So it's kind of interesting that you're kind of comparing, you use that comparison to Syria, right? But I think the main difference in Myanmar is if you thought there was a lot of groups in Syria, like, well, get ready for Myanmar, right? And you kind of highlighted broadly, kind of within the forces that are opposing the junta, you have the opposition and kind of these ethnic groups. And it does look like the difference this latest round of the civil war is just kind of this connection between the ethnic groups and the opposition kind of coordinating a lot of aspects. But before we go to that point, I would love for you to kind of highlight key ethnic groups that have been fighting the junta for decades now, and also the kind of the opposition, and then we can kind of get into the details of the coordination. But what are the key ethnic groups that you track and monitor, do you think are the most important ones that are fighting the junta, and then the opposition forces as well?
Yeah, so like if the viewers would check out a map of Myanmar right now, imagine that like the main, like the dominant ethnic group in the country, the Myanmar, from which, the country of Burma was originally named after by the British. The Myanmar are the dominant group in Myanmar, both in like just sheer size of numbers, but also in like that they dominate the current military, but also the political opposition. But they're really focused in the center of the country. Myanmar is basically one giant river delta surrounded by mountains and rainforest. And the Myanmar basically dominate the delta. That's their territory. Then in all the regions around it, like the mountains, the forests, the hills, that are also part of the country of Myanmar, those are dominated by very different ethnic groups, and that also most of the time have their own region. So like you have a state on the border with India, Chin state, which is dominated by the Chin groups. You have a region in the north of the country, which borders China, which is inhabited by the Kachin, and it has a likewise name. And you have ethnic groups on the border with Thailand, the Karen and the Karenni. And what basically happened was after the country of Myanmar, or as Burma as it was called at the time, gained its independence from the British after World War II, was that the ethnic Myanmar basically seized control of the state in its entirety, and it very much became an ethnically dominated state. So what a lot of these other ethnic groups, the minorities, did, the Kachin, the Karen, the Karenni, was that they took up arms and started fighting for either the independence of their region or the autonomy of their region. And these groups were already very successful in that early on because of a number of factors, like one of them being that their home regions, from a geographic point of view, were very favorable towards resistance activities because they're mountains, they're rainforest. It's very hard for an established army to maintain control there. And also because a lot of these ethnic groups were actually favored by the British during World War II, during the military campaigns against Japanese occupation in Myanmar, while the ethnic Myanmar actually were favored by the Japanese. So the ethnic groups were already armed and trained by the British during World War II, and afterwards basically had the expertise and the weapons and the favorable landscape to launch successful armed uprisings against this military government. And even though they never really succeeded in fully taking control of their regions, of like actively gaining independence, some got some degree of autonomy through negotiations, but a military victory was still always out of reach for these groups. And what we saw now with the current conflict that was sparked by the coup 4 years ago was that it created a new momentum for these groups. Because now it was not just the ethnic minorities that was fighting basically the political establishment, the military regime. It was also the Bamar people, the Bamar students, the Bamar farmers themselves. And that created a whole new momentum for the ethnic armed groups to basically re-up their own efforts to take control of their own regions. And in that, when you compare it to Syria, you're definitely right that it's a lot more groups compared to Syria. But I would say that now, when you just look at the current situation in Myanmar, there's one major difference when you compare it to like Syria in its high days of different factions, like 10 years ago or something, was that in Syria you had a lot of different groups which had like a shared ethnic or religious background. So you had like hundreds of different Sunni rebel groups, a dozen or so, I don't know, like Kurdish groups, Christian groups, whatever. That's like shared the same sort of societal backgrounds, but had very different political understandings. And in Myanmar, you sort of see the other way around. So you have a lot of different groups from different ethnic communities, ethnic backgrounds, but on a wholesale political level, they all seem to agree at the moment. They all seem to agree that the military regime has to be fought, has to be overthrown, but also that for the moment, a democracy, and as is now the consensus, a federal democracy, with high level of autonomy for the regions, is the political outcome that should come out of this war. So in that sense, there are now no ethnic armed groups in Myanmar that are fighting for like a full-on independence, or like really fighting to succeed their region in its entirety. So in that sense, there is on the political level a shared goal that all these different groups are fighting towards, which gives a very interesting situation on the ground, where you have like more than a dozen different groups with different languages, different flags, different symbols, different patches on their uniforms, that are all fighting for a shared goal.
So I think it's an interesting, if you look at Myanmar from a historical point of view, there's always kind of been this tendency for authoritarian rule. And we had, brief periods of maybe, let's say the term loosely democratic rule, but the military has always been, I think, undisputable, the primary powerhouse of Myanmar's politics since its independence, even during Burma and then Myanmar. The military has always been the key power player in Myanmar. And then with this brief period of democratic elections, with the elections of Aung San Suu Kyi, she was even very cognizant of kind of this relationship with the military, where she gave deference to the military in many aspects because of the understanding that they still held a lot of military power. And more importantly, to highlight, even during that democratic transition, the military basically had veto over a lot of the domestic and international relations. And I think the military kind of maybe overstepped itself with this coup, thinking that they can go to what they used to do in the past, which is, yes, they had ethnic conflicts with various rebel groups, as you highlighted, but they always had this tactic of maybe negotiating and having a ceasefire with one group, and then they focus their attention on another. But now it seems like they completely overestimated their own power capabilities, and now the main ethnic group in Myanmar is an open revolt. But more importantly, there has been this alliance between the opposition and these ethnic groups, under the umbrella, I think, the Three Brotherhood Alliance, that is really putting pressure on the junta. And it does look like at some point the junta doesn't have that much more tools left available. And so from your, reporting and your experiences in Myanmar, why do you think the junta decided to launch this coup? And did they think that they just overestimated their military capability and they didn't foresee this coalescing with the opposition and these ethnic rebels?
Yeah, I would say that like the current military regime, which is in the same way also the former military regime, because it basically had total control over Myanmar. There was like a military junta in control of the country also from the 1960s up until like the 2010s. And so basically, by that fact, the current military regime is also, it's a 20th century regime, basically. It held power for 50, 60 years in the 20th century. It briefly gave up power in the 2010s and shared it with the democratic government, not necessarily because, it wanted to democratize or out of the goodness of its heart, but just, to get some sanction relief and have less reliance on China. And I think definitely like the military or like the military leadership, which when you look at them are all, these generals in their 60s and 70s from like a very different generation than the people that took up arms against them. They figured, they could just, once the democratic political forces sort of overstepped the line that the military had envisioned, they could just seize power back for themselves, prematurely end the democratic experiment as they would see it, and just, like turn back the clock towards the 20th century when they had total control of the country. Of course, they would have expected some protests, some unrest. But I mean, like throughout Myanmar's modern history, there have been a lot of pro-democracy, anti-junta uprisings, the most prominent of which were the 1988 revolution, which brought forward Aung San Suu Kyi as like a leader of democratic opposition. There was also what's known as the Saffron Revolution of 2007, when the monks rose up against the military regime. And the military regime always managed to prevail over those uprisings just through brute force and through repression. At the time, there were also some limited number of ethnic Bamar, mostly students, that decided to head into the jungle and join opposition groups. But there were always a marginal group, especially within the Bamar society. But I think that what the military really missed this time, or what they failed to appreciate, was that within that 10 years of democratic experiment, let's refer to this, that the 10 years of that democratic experiment, an entire generation of Burmese youth came of age, like the millennials or the Gen Z or what have you, and they basically grew up in a relatively open society, a society that received a lot of foreign tourists, a society that was also really making progress with some of the ethnic armed groups on the path of peace negotiations. And the military very brutally and unapologetically just took all of that away in one night. And so instead of just a couple hundred or a couple thousand of high educated students that were protesting against the regime and deciding to pick up arms to fight for a democratic state, basically had an entire generation of often very tech savvy Burmese youth, which really helped sustain at first the protest part of this anti-coup movement, and then really the armed movements that came out of it. So in that sense, the military regime was very slow to react to it. And even now, today, when you just look at how the regime operates, it's still very slow. It also surprised me how incapable this regime is of learning and of adapting. And that's primarily in two aspects. The military aspect, which is very ironic for a military regime, but okay, like the military aspect, and also like the propaganda aspect in the information sphere. And first in the military aspect, in that the military has been fighting a very static kind of war, in the sense of if it wants to maintain control over a rebellious region, a region inhabited by ethnic minority, which has 3 or 4 ethnic groups or whatever present, what they do is they build a lot of hilltop camps or bases, dump a couple hundred soldiers there, and just let them, sit there and see how long they can bear it out before the base gets overrun. They have been doing that at hundreds of hilltops across the country. But so for the resistance, that was basically easy picking. So what the resistance was had to do, take these hilltop camps out one by one and slowly expand their area. So where the resistance and the ethnic armed groups, like the armed rebellion in its entirety, has been able to fight the regime in a relatively fluid manner, the regime has really been, putting bullseyes on its head, just building these targets, these hilltop camps, and waiting for the resistance to hit them. And you would think that after 4 years of this war and 4 years of the regime losing these kind of positions one by one, that they would also alter their own strategy in that. But they still have not done that. They're still incapable of learning a new, more modern military strategy. And that's not the military aspect. Then on the propaganda aspect, when we think of other embattled authoritarian regimes, the Assad regime, but also, the Russians, the Venezuelans, the Iranians, when you try to follow the news of that country or reported on it or participate in discussion about it online, you've undoubtedly come across either these anonymous trolls or these supporters of theirs, that they try, at least figures or accounts that try to spread the narrative of the embattled regime in the English language online circles. The regime from Myanmar, the military, has not done anything like that at all. There is no savvy English YouTube channel to spread regime narratives. There are no propagandists to make these items or to go online and try to tell the military side of the story. There's nothing like that. So they don't appreciate the fact that also in this online day and age, the information sphere, the online sphere, it can be just as essential for winning a conflict than the literal battlefield in the country itself. And they've completely disregarded the entire cyber aspects of legitimizing a regime and maintaining the dominant narrative in a conflict.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I was actually, that last point is the one that's kind of interesting to me. Is, especially in the Middle East, you see all of these regimes really working hard to legitimize themselves, not just in the eyes of any potential supporters within their country, but the international community. You know, I I can say pretty confidently, I don't think most international observers, even some that are rather educated, including ourselves, we don't really hear too much about the junta. The people we hear the most about, I would say, in terms of public relations, would be these rebels. They do a pretty good job of advertising their victories and their cause, but you'd be hard pressed to find serious Western publications talking about the junta and what they're doing. So yeah, I definitely agree. They've kind of been faltering in that public relations and relevance battle, which is pretty important to modern movements. HTS did a rather good job, I would say, with that in Syria. They really made a point of running a campaign socially as well on that rebellion against the Assad regime.
Yeah, and I think they really see what I briefly mentioned before is the generational gap between those two warring sides. Like the leadership of the military regime are all these dinosaurs in their 60s and 70s from, with a really 20th century view of the world and 20th century mindset, while the resistance, the rebellion is really carried by all these young people, all these millennials, all these students, all these high schoolers even, that really know how to, form a narrative, gather online support, really, appeal to a wider international audience. And there's like one funny anecdote that really tells you a lot about, just sort of the way of thinking of these military generals, is that the generals have always been very notorious for their sort of their beliefs. What's the word I'm looking for? Like they have some very odd beliefs. Look, example was in the past when they used to be in control of the country in their first run of their military regime. Like they would publish banknotes in the numbers of like 7 or 14 or like very odd number to put on cash, but they did it because like those were considered their lucky numbers. So if they would do it, then they would figure like it would secure their rule. A superstition, that's the word I was looking for. Like they're very notorious for their superstition. Like another example was that the current junta leader at the time once had a bad dream, and when he woke up from the bad dream, he decided to build an entirely new capital, because in his dream he apparently had received a message like, if you stay in your old capital, the city of Yangon at the time, you would be overthrown. So he decided to build an entire new capital up in the mountains, which we now know as Naypyidaw. Their latest notorious stint in their superstition is that in like the Burmese branch of the Buddhist branch that is like dominant in Myanmar, white elephants are considered a sign of luck and good fortune. So back in, I believe it was like 2022, when somewhere in Myanmar a little white elephant calf was born. The junta leaders they tried, they got it as soon as they could, and they paraded it around the capital, and for them it was like a sign of, it's all going to be all right, we're going to overcome all the challenges like the armed rebellion, and we will prevail. And there's still some people that say like, well, the junta's inability or unwillingness to change course, to change strategy, also in the military front, is partly maybe even because they still tell themselves, we have a white elephant, we will prevail. It's our good fortune. We don't need to change gears. We have our lucky charm. We'll just sit it out until the end. And it sounds ridiculous and laughable, but when you look at the junta's own history, there is reason to actually, to believe in this claim, that they actually do think, and that their brains click in this way.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see it that way. I was actually not aware of some of these stories. I mean, superstition in East Asia is not unheard of, but it's kind of almost comedic to me to see it taken to such an extreme by an authoritarian regime. But Stefano, I know you had a question before
Yeah.
me, so please do go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think the interesting aspect of when you're looking at Myanmar from a social media perspective is the importance of Facebook, right? I think Facebook is a casebook study of like kind of this idea of the spread of like misinformation specific. I mean, it's been very highlighted a lot how Facebook led to the Rohingya genocide and the conflict of Rakhine State. And I think Facebook still plays a very primary role from an information space when analyzing Myanmar. And we highlighted the Rohingya and the Rakhine State and the conflict there. But even in the modern sense, in this current civil war, I mean, it still plays a huge role. But one aspect I kind of wanted to ask you is when you're looking at this current state, right? Because if you look at Myanmar, we highlighted, I mean, the civil war has been going on since its inception as an independent country, and there's so many different conflicts that we need to analyze. But in this current state, in 2021, it did look like the junta was going to prevail. It took a while for this kind of these opposition groups to coalesce and to really challenge. And what really indicated a change in the situation on the ground was when the formation of the Three Brotherhood Alliance really started to challenge the junta. And that's kind of within the last 4 years. It took the opposition quite a bit to get there. So how do you think the opposition managed to form this very successful armed group? And does it show that even the opposition was caught off guard by the coup, and that they needed time to coalesce and form these armed groups that then allied themselves with these ethnic groups to really challenge the junta?
Yeah, I think it makes sense that it took a while, because especially for all the Burmese students and the protesters that joined the armed rebellion, they never carried a gun before in their lives. So at first, of course, there was a lot of training to be had, and they needed to set up a network of resistance cells or resistance groups. Then, like, already I would say like a year into the post-coup conflict, there were already signs that the regime was slowly losing ground, and not necessarily in a sort of shock offensive that we saw with the Three Brotherhood Alliance, but more in just an increase of like ambushes, guerrilla attacks. The size of the regions where resistance groups would operate, would show themselves, like, also more bolder actions, like resistance fighters taking pictures or filming themselves walking along like major roads or highways, or setting up administration in villages and such. But with any armed resistance group that starts in like a guerrilla phase, the first phase of the guerrilla fighting itself is very essential one, but always takes a long time. From their secluded mountaintops, their forest hideouts, they started attacking regime convoys and like frustrating supply lines, taking out junta soldiers in limited numbers, making sure that the regime really had to spread out all the resource it's had to as many restive regions as there were. And then at some point, the Three Brotherhood Alliance, which is a very loose coalition of 3 ethnic armed groups, 2 in the largest state of Myanmar, Shan State, bordered by Myanmar and China, and 1 the Arakan army in the Rakhine region, where also the Rohingya come from. And then that coalition saw an opening to really launch a shock offensive against the junta in the northern half of Shan State. And that really then caused a sort of a domino effect, because they then, for the first time since the coup, managed to take a number of larger towns in a relatively short time span, like a couple of weeks. And that really demonstrated a larger weakness by the military regime, which also then other armed groups saw an opportunity to launch attacks in their region and take control of townships in their homeland. And so that was really then, in a sense, a turning point. The operation was called Operation 1027 because it was launched on the 27th of October. And everyone in Myanmar will agree that like Operation 1027 was really a significant turning point in the overall armed rebellion against the junta, because on that day, the armed resistance against the junta basically switched from a guerrilla struggle against a conventional liberation war, where instead of conducting ambushes and frustrating the regime in its place, the armed groups really went to liberating entire swaths of territory and ousting the regimes from entire states of the country.
So Thomas, I was curious. I've seen several videos from this conflict, and I was curious, what do you think the role that China is playing in this conflict is? How extensive is it? I know recently Chinese officials visited the Thai border to examine the crackdown on these scam centers. A lot of those people are basically human trafficked to participate in those scams. But what I've also seen is a lot of these militants are well armed and fairly well equipped. So, for example, I've seen a lot of use of the fast helmets, which are the special forces type helmets. I don't know if those are knockoffs that might be coming from China, but if you could expand on China's role and who is funding and supplying these groups.
Yeah, China really has a lot of different interests in Myanmar. Interested might also sometimes even seem contradictory toward itself. China has been a natural ally of the junta in the sense of like, they're both authoritarian regimes, both very suspicious of like democracy and Western interest, for example. But then the Myanmar junta and the Chinese have historically also been very distrusting of each other, simply because the Myanmar military is a very ethno-nationalist military for the Bamar ethnic group. And they've always distrusted Chinese interest and Chinese influence in their country. So there were some reports that the Chinese initially backed the coup that took place in 2021. But we know from the Chinese that they're also very opportunistic when it comes to their foreign policy. So the Chinese have also, throughout Myanmar's conflict history, supported armed rebel groups to maintain a certain level of influence over them. With some groups, it can also be because of ethnic relations. For example, there's one rebel group in Myanmar known as the MNDAA, which represents ethnic Chinese within Myanmar's border regions. So there's also like some kin relations between them and the Chinese government. And the Chinese are, in that sense, really playing a lot of different sides, and they think and they'll do business with whoever comes out on top. In that sense, what makes Myanmar a very interesting case, it then, contrary to other wars, like the Israel-Palestine, Ukraine, even Sudan, where international involvement is very high and different sides are really, competing with each other or taking on each other through the conflict itself. Myanmar is a conflict that it's really, ever since the coup existed and developed in isolation. There's no sort of frame to which you could present Myanmar as a proxy war. The Chinese are somewhat supportive of the junta, but also support rebel groups. The Indians, which are also a very important relation of the Myanmar junta and border them, they've also been relatively supportive of the military regime, but not up to a very high level. You have, of course, the Western countries, the Americans, up until the Trump administration. The Americans had a very sympathetic policy towards the armed resistance in Myanmar, towards the NUG, which is like the government in exile of the opposition, and towards just the general struggle against military rule. But I think that the West's involvement in Myanmar has also been very little to non-existent, because the Western countries are really learned from what happened in, for example, Syria, where they also supported, the armed rebellion against President Assad. But we all know what happens then. It's they supplied the rebels with anti-tank weapons, with training programs, and then it created a counter response from the Russians, who basically went all in with airstrikes and boots on the ground and entire military campaigns to defeat the rebels. I think the calculation in a lot of Western capitals in Myanmar has always been, if we now go in and support the armed opposition, that might provoke China into really backing the junta, because then China will see it as a zero-sum game, and they will think, if the junta falls, then we will lose our influence there and the West will take over. While when you just look at the current situation, where the conflict is basically walking its course in isolation, and there's very little international involvement, that it might even lead to the collapse of the military regime after all. And so that's also in a way then the irony for a lot of the Burmese people themselves, that actually having their conflict being such a low priority in international relations, in the international stage, that their conflict being ignored by so many great powers might actually be a blessing in the sky, because it might mean that they will only have to fight the regime themselves, and that then if you just look at the trajectory of the conflict, it's very likely that the regime will fall after all, and that there will not be any major foreign backer that might sustain the regime longer, again, like we saw with the Assad regime in Syria.
So, Thomas, if I can ask a follow-up question to that, because I mean, Myanmar has played a role in, China's expansion. We've even seen China, India. We've seen Russia. President Obama famously went to Myanmar. Is there's this belief in your suspicion, right, that Myanmar, is it kind of from an international policy point of view, is the belief that whoever's in power in Myanmar, any of the great powers and international players can basically, there's a thought process, we can deal with whoever's in power. This is just an internal conflict, and we just don't want to get involved, because the Myanmar situation, even regionally or locally, like we've talked about the Democratic Republic of Congo in previous podcasts, and we see, the players even regionally, such as Rwanda, Uganda, etc., kind of playing a role in that war. But in Myanmar, it looks like nobody really wants to get involved. And there's this belief that, at least internationally or even regionally, that whoever's in power, the great powers of that region or the neighbors can say, oh, we can deal with whoever. Like, why do you believe this isn't a focal point, not only internationally, but even regionally?
Yeah, I think definitely regionally, that's how they look at it. The Chinese, but also the Thai, and maybe to a lesser extent the Indians. They figure, we can do business with whoever is in power, because they also, in a sense, had 10 years of experience with a democratic government in Myanmar which worked out fine for everyone. I mean, yeah, you mentioned President Obama, who visited Myanmar and in the democratic period. A lot of other Western countries then really strengthened their bonds with the country. But Myanmar still had very good relations with all its neighbors. You know, President Xi Jinping of China, on a personal level, also really liked Aung San Suu Kyi. So like, and that is really what differentiates it from a country like Syria, for example, where HTS and the new administration in the Syrian government is completely new. Like very little countries have any actual experience with dealing with them on a diplomatic level, while on Myanmar they sort of know who these people are, you know, and how to deal with them. Then on like the international arena, it's a little bit differently, interestingly enough, because of course you have the Western countries who, like from a moral point of view, cannot really deal with the military regime. So like they would only like to deal with the democratic government. But I think they're also a bit hesitant about now really, like I said, throwing their weight behind the current armed opposition and their administration exile. And then, for example, you have the Russians who, you know, view the entire world in a zero-sum geopolitical game. And they're really pro-junta. They really support the regime, at least on diplomatic level, because they of course consider Myanmar on par with Syria as like a Western-backed regime change plot, and they see the Myanmar junta as like a anti-Western ally that they could do business with. But you know, even though as much as the Russians, I think, would have liked it, they're incapable of like really coming to the regime's aid, or even doing something as little as you know, sending a couple Wagner, or now I think Afrika Korps as they're now called, a couple hundred Afrika Korps soldiers to the country as like mercenaries and help fight the resistance, because China still does consider Myanmar part of its own sphere of influence, and will not tolerate any Russian interventions in its own backyard. So in that sense, even you know, the Russians would not be competing. They would think that they would be competing against the West in Myanmar, but the Chinese would view that very differently, and that's why the Russians so far have not been able to come to the regime's aid, and basically no one has really come to the regime's aid now in this hour of its need.
So, while we're talking about international relations, Myanmar has a strategic significance, although it's not quite on the Strait of Malacca. Their exclusive economic zone is still very important with the Andaman Sea. How do you see like the United States interests? Are we ignoring what could be something that the United States should be more involved with diplomatically?
Well, I think we would have to look at it with like the previous administration and how it was on the Biden administration, because with the current Trump administration, it's really unclear. They haven't really said anything about Myanmar, that there's no clear strategy, except maybe that they would view it through, you know, their anti-China prism. With the Biden administration, there was at least the moral support for the armed opposition. There were also, for example, in Congress had passed something known as the Burma Act, which allowed for non-lethal assistance toward armed opposition groups in Myanmar. And it was definitely during the Biden administrations in America's interest that the junta in Myanmar would fall and that like a new democratic government would take hold. But I think the Americans in that sense always, you know, were reminded by Syria when looking at Myanmar, in that they tried to back the opposition in Syria. They were willing to give some supplies, to give some training, but not to go all in the sense of like a no-fly zone. And then that provoked the Russian counter response. And then the regime was basically, the survival of the regime was prolonged for another decade or so. While, you know, you could have made the arguments that if the West had not intervened in Syria, then maybe the Russians wouldn't have either. And the Assad regime could already have fallen 10 years or even longer ago. So I think the Americans were treading very carefully with Myanmar in order not to provoke any response from the Chinese or other regions. And I think at best, what President Joe Biden, for example, was able to do was try to talk to Myanmar's neighbors, at least the friendly ones towards the US, like Thailand and like India, and to also keep them out of it. Like India, for example, has been, I would say, the most sympathetic towards the Myanmar regime of all of Myanmar's neighbors, because like Myanmar borders a very restive region of India, the 7 states, which has a lot of ethnic minorities itself, groups that like in the past have risen up against, excuse me, against the central government in India. So India was always very afraid of a spillover effect should the military regime in Myanmar collapse. And that's why India is, of all the bordering countries, probably the most sympathetic towards the junta survival. And the Americans have always tried to, keep Modi away from really backing the military. So whenever Biden and Modi had a meeting and they would afterwards address the press, they would always quickly mention Burma or Myanmar and like their shared view of a end to the conflict. And aside from that, there was really not a lot that the US could do directly in the conflict because it was really too far away. And, there were also other priorities. There was the war in Ukraine. There was the conflict in Gaza. There was COVID. There was always a more pressing matter than the conflict in Myanmar. And that's really, I would say, like a recurring theme in the entirety of Myanmar's conflict and the place that it has in international relations, that it is never a priority.
So you mentioned Russia's intervention into Syria, and you also mentioned Ukraine. I think from the way I was viewing this, that the intervention into Syria by Russia was linked almost directly to the backlash they received in 2014 for their intervention into Ukraine. But going back to what you were talking about with the countries in the region in Indo-Pacific that are friendly to the United States, I think balancing is something that we should be taking into consideration. And just because Myanmar is not bordering the South China Sea doesn't mean that this conflict isn't very important to the United States. And I don't see much focus on it. So how do you think we can talk about this in a way that sort of illustrates the United States' interests in the region and ties that to what's going on in Myanmar? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that if you look at it from American point of view, a lot of if you would ask people in Myanmar what they're fighting for, they would really be appealing to a wider American audience, because they are fighting for democratic rule, for their liberties, for just to be able to live in a free and open society. So really like what we would describe as the Western values, which we would embrace as the Western values. And there really is, even though like the Chinese government itself might be trying to play different sides in Myanmar, to many Burmese, it's very clear who their friends are and who are their enemies, like anti-China feelings or like or some protest actions happen a lot of times in Myanmar. Like the other day, for example, some Burmese activists like put a Winnie the Pooh stuffed animal with his head covered and a note saying like be careful, she in a public park in Yangon, sort of send a warning. So there's very much the view in Myanmar itself that like the Chinese is a enemy of the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar. So definitely in a wider American strategy in the Indo-Pacific to counter China, that would really offer an opportunity in Myanmar. But And, like Myanmar has always been a very, very bipartisan issue in Congress and the Senate. Like Mitch McConnell has been one of the strongest supporters of Burmese democracy throughout the 1990s and up to this day.
So, Thomas, I before we wrap this episode up, I do want to just give you the opportunity, because you've done a lot of tracking of the military movements and the territorial control. That's something that you really highlight, and I think it's very informative for people who don't know the current civil war and even just the geographical representation of Myanmar, what's kind of going on the ground. And so, kind of like this, this one of the ways that we can close this up. I would love to hear your opinion and your prediction from a military point of view. Where do you think the opposition is going to continue? Because for the most part, it looks like the rebels, both the ethnic groups and the opposition, basically control almost the entirety of all the borders of Myanmar with foreign countries, right? Almost for the most part. And so the Myanmar government basically has kind of the heartland and the access to the sea still available to them. So how do you think the rebels are going to continue their offensive actions? And where are the cities or towns or states do you think the next push will be from the opposition?
Right. Like in Myanmar, I would say like the advance of the opposition at the moment has been rather slow. I think that's partly because Myanmar is now in the dry season, which means clear skies, which means it's very easy for the junta to send out its warplanes and bomb rebel areas. So I expect that once the monsoon season starts in a few months, that will give like the resistance like the cover it needs to launch more attacks. And with Myanmar military, we haven't seen like the complete dramatic collapse that we saw in Syria in December. But with the Myanmar military, the thing is like it can only bend so far before it really breaks. And it seems that we are heading for that breaking point. Myanmar in its geography, which I briefly explained before, like you have the flat delta in the middle and the surrounding mountainous areas as a ring around it. The fighting is still taking place primarily in the ring. That's where the opposition has their strongholds. That's where they're taking out the military bases. But we have also seen recently a gradual move of resistance fighters towards the delta to start to basically repeat the first phase of their armed rebellion there, to launch ambushes, guerrilla attacks, to really frustrate regime supply lines, only now in the right center of the country, the perceived stronghold of the military. So what is now the big expectation is that once the resistance will completely take all the border regions, then it will go very quickly, because then they have the entire high ground, all the mountains. They also have the bulk of the military's supplies and infrastructure, because throughout 70 years of insurgency and counterinsurgency, the regime has basically placed its entire military infrastructure in those border regions. So the delta is really also a soft underbelly with very little physical the defense lines or protection, military bases, what have you, by the regime. The most general expectation is that the point where the military regime might collapse might be a development in the west of the country, where we now see that one of the most dominant armed groups, the Arakan army, is advancing outside of its home region, Rakhine, which it now controls for like 95%, and it's approaching very closely to a region which has what is known as the Kapa Sa factories. The Kapa Sa factories are like 20, 25 factories, like a chain, and that's the bulk of the military's entire military industry. Once the Arakan army will be able to reach those factories and take them out or take them over, then the regime will probably collapse very quickly, because it will have no chain of supplies for ammunition or whatever to its own men anymore. So it's very hard to predict when exactly that will happen, and whether this conflict will last another year, maybe shorter, maybe longer. But the trajectory towards a military collapse is still very much present. And it really looks like much more of a matter of if instead of like a when instead of if. as long as like there will not be any dramatic changes in the international arena. Like as long as all the current international players, like the countries on its border, internationally maintain the same stance that they had during the first 4 years of this conflict, and the Burmese will really be left to fight their own war, then the trajectory is really pointing towards a regime collapse and like a really run on the capital at some point.
So if let's play a scenario where the opposition wins and they're in power. Do you think that the opposition will not kind of, from their perspective, repeat the mistakes of the past where they gave the Myanmar military, kind of substantial political power and basically a veto? Do you believe there will be an attempt to completely dismantle kind of the Myanmar military deep state? Because I think that's an apt term, kind of the deep state, and not even deep. I mean, they are the state. So do you believe that the opposition, if they were in power, will completely dismantle any, form of the Myanmar military and start over with a new federal military? Do you think that's the plan that they're going to have in place?
I think that's the plan, but whether that plan will succeed will be very difficult. I think I think what's not really a big risk for opposition is that they would like maintain those deep state infrastructures. I think they have a larger risk of maintaining that ethnic Bamar majority in their state institutions, right? Like if in a scenario that the resistance defeats the military, that the military collapses, and that like the government in exile, the opposition takes over the capital, all the ethnic minorities that have been fighting the regime for the past 70 years and have really been carrying this armed rebellion for the past 4 years, they will demand a larger stake in how things are run. I don't think the groups will really demand independence, primarily because like the bordering countries, China, India, Thailand, all have their own restive ethnic minorities, restive areas, so they will never tolerate a sort of balkanization of Myanmar. But the groups will definitely demand more political influence, definitely more autonomy, and a bigger state in how the state is run. And I think it will be very much a challenge for the NUG, the opposition government in exile, which is still primarily run by Bamar, only instead of military men, it's now like opposition politicians, for them to really find a way to share power among all the different peoples of the country. And how they will go about that, that remains to be seen. Because even though like the NUG in such a scenario might be recognized as the transitional government, like receive all the international accreditation, recognition, whatever, the men with the guns, who will still be the ethnic armies, will be the ones who have the last say in that scenario.
Well, Thomas, I think that we had a long conversation about the situation in Myanmar, and I really appreciate your opportunity to kind of explain it. But I think you highlighted something there, to kind of wrap this up, is that this isn't, even with the junta falling, this isn't the end of the story. It's just the next chapter of a long history that we've encountered in Myanmar of ethnic tensions and civil war. And I do agree with you, it does look like the junta this time around is basically counting its days. I think it's a question of when, not if. But it does indicate that the problems that Myanmar will have, even a post-junta government, will be significant, and we might not be hearing the end of the story. But before we wrap up, Thomas, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say any final words, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, it's looking at just how diverse Myanmar is as a country. Like you could really describe it a bit as a rainbow nation. Like it has more than a dozen different languages. Every region has like its own dominant ethnic group. So, and in that sense, like in a post junta scenario, which seems to be becoming closer by the day, it can really go two ways. It can become, for example, it's like the worst case scenario, like in Ethiopia, where they like overthrew a military dictatorship at the end of the 1980s. and they're still fighting all these ethnic and regional wars amongst each other. Or it could end up in a much more peaceful and favorable way. Like despite all its faults, like India has been able to keep all the different regions together since independence. In South Africa is another example that comes to mind. And really how that will play out, and how the different peoples of Myanmar will be able to come together in a post-junta country and find a way forward in, like, as I preferred, a federal democratic state. We can only hope for the best, and like hope that you know, democratic states will prevail over the ethnic strifes.
Well, thank you so much, Thomas. You're welcome back anytime. This has been The Bottom Line Up Front, and we'll talk to you soon.